When Truth walked through the door, the autumn sunlight filtered through the windows of Lincoln Middle School, casting warm patterns across the classroom floor. Ms. Catherine Reynolds stood at the front of her 7th grade history class, her perfectly pressed blazer and confident demeanor reflecting her 20 years of teaching experience. She had always prided herself on maintaining order and discipline in her classroom. "Class, settle down," she announced, tapping her desk with a ruler. "Today we're discussing military hierarchy and leadership in American history." 12-year-old Marcus Williams sat quietly in the third row, his dark eyes focused on the assignment sheet before him. He was a thoughtful boy, the kind who preferred listening to speaking, observing to participating. His classmates knew him as someone who kept to himself, carrying a quiet dignity that seemed unusual for someone his age. For homework, Ms. Reynolds continued, "I want each of you to write about someone in your family who serves or has served in the military. Include their rank, their branch of service, and what their sacrifice means to America." Hands shot up around the room. Tommy Patterson called out that his uncle was in the Navy. Sarah Chen mentioned her grandfather's service in Vietnam. But Marcus remained silent, his pencil moving steadily across his paper. The next day, students filed to the front of the room, reading their assignments aloud. Stories of courage and service filled the air, each one met with polite applause from Ms. Reynolds. When Marcus's turn came, he walked slowly to the front, holding his paper with both hands. "My father is General David Williams," Marcus began, his voice quiet but steady. "He's a 4-star general in the United States Army. He's served our country for 30 years, leading troops in multiple deployments overseas. He's taught me that true leadership means—" "Stop right there," Ms. Reynolds interrupted, her voice sharp and cold. "Marcus, I will not tolerate dishonesty in my classroom." The room fell silent. Marcus looked up, confusion crossing his face. "Ma'am, I don't understand. There's no way your father is a 4-star general," she said, her words cutting through the air like ice. "Do you have any idea how rare that rank is? There are only a handful of 4-star generals in the entire United States military." Marcus's classmates began to whisper. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared, waiting to see what would happen next. "But it's true," Marcus insisted, his voice smaller now. "My dad really is. I've had enough of this fantasy," Ms. Reynolds snapped. She strode toward him and, in one swift motion, ripped the paper from his hands, tearing it into pieces. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the silent classroom. "You will write a truthful assignment, young man, or you'll receive a 0. Go sit down." Marcus stood frozen, watching the pieces of his paper flutter to the floor. His throat tightened, but he refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of everyone. He gathered what remained of his dignity and walked back to his seat, each step feeling heavier than the last. His classmates didn't know what to say. Even the ones who might have defended him stayed quiet, unsure and afraid. The rest of the class dragged on in uncomfortable silence, the joy of sharing family stories replaced by tension and shame. That evening, Marcus sat at the dinner table, pushing food around his plate. His mother, Grace Williams, noticed immediately. After 30 years of marriage to a military man, she had learned to read people, especially her own son. "Baby, what's wrong?" she asked gently, setting down her fork. Marcus shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Something happened at school," she pressed. "Talk to me." The words tumbled out then, the whole humiliating story. Grace listened, her expression growing more serious with each sentence. When Marcus finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Your father is at the Pentagon this week," she said carefully, "but he'll be visiting your school on Friday for the Veterans Day Assembly. I think he should know about this." Marcus shook his head quickly. "No, Mom, please. It'll just make things worse." But Grace Williams was not a woman who let injustice stand, especially when it hurt her child. That night, she made a phone call. Friday morning arrived with a crispness in the air that promised winter was coming. The school gymnasium filled with students, teachers, and parents, all gathered for the annual Veterans Day Assembly. Red, white, and blue decorations hung from the walls. A small podium stood at the front, flanked by American flags. Ms. Reynolds sat with her class, feeling satisfied with the assembly she had helped organize. She had invited several local veterans to speak, proud of her contribution to honoring those who served. Principal Henderson stepped to the microphone. Good morning, everyone. Today we have a very special guest. It's my distinct honor to introduce a man who has dedicated his life to protecting our nation. Please welcome General David Williams, 4-star General of the United States Army. The side door opened, and General Williams entered the gymnasium. His uniform was immaculate, rows of ribbons and medals spanning his chest. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders, catching the light. His presence commanded immediate attention, the kind of quiet authority that comes only from decades of leadership. Ms. Reynolds felt the blood drain from her face. She turned to look at Marcus, who sat 3 rows ahead, and saw him holding up a photograph, the same one he had tried to show her days earlier. His father, in full dress uniform, 4 stars clearly visible. The gymnasium erupted in applause, but Ms. Reynolds barely heard it. Her mind raced back to Monday, to the paper she had torn, to the words she had spoken with such certainty, such dismissiveness. General Williams spoke about service, about sacrifice, about the importance of believing in young people and supporting their dreams. His voice was strong but warm, filled with the wisdom of someone who had led soldiers through the hardest moments of their lives. "I want to say something to all the students here today," he said, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Marcus. "Never let anyone tell you that you cannot achieve something because of who you are or where you come from. I grew up in a neighborhood where people said a kid who looked like me couldn't become a general. But I had teachers who believed in me, who saw my potential, who pushed me to be better." He paused, and in that pause, Ms. Reynolds felt the weight of every word she had spoken to Marcus. "And to the educators here," General Williams continued, "thank you for the work you do. You have the power to build up or tear down. Please, always choose to build up. Believe in these young people, even when they're telling you something that seems impossible." Especially then. When the assembly ended, General Williams stood by the door, shaking hands and taking photos. Students and teachers lined up to meet him. Ms. Reynolds remained in her seat, unable to move, watching Marcus stand beside his father with quiet pride. Principal Henderson approached her. "Catherine, General Williams has requested a moment with you in my office." The walk down that hallway was the longest of her professional life. In the principal's office, General Williams stood beside Marcus, his hand on his son's shoulder. Grace Williams sat nearby, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Reynolds," the general began, his voice measured and calm, "my son told me what happened in your classroom this week." She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, but he raised a hand gently. "I want you to understand something," he continued. "When you tore up that paper, you didn't just dismiss an assignment. You told my son that his truth wasn't valid. That his pride in his father's service didn't matter. That he, himself, didn't matter enough to be believed." Tears stung Ms. Reynolds' eyes. "Sir, I had no idea. I just assumed." "You assumed," he said, and those 2 words carried more weight than any accusation. "In my 30 years of military service, I've learned that assumptions are dangerous. They close our minds to possibilities. They prevent us from seeing the truth right in front of us." Marcus stood silently, watching his teacher crumble under the weight of her own actions. "I should have believed you," Ms. Reynolds said, turning to Marcus. "I should have listened. I should have asked questions instead of making judgments. I am so sorry." The boy nodded, not quite ready to speak. General Williams softened slightly. "Ms. Reynolds, I don't believe you're a bad teacher. I think you made a mistake, a serious one. The question now is, what will you do with this lesson?" Over the following weeks, something shifted in room 304. Ms. Reynolds didn't just apologize once and move on. She examined her assumptions, her biases, the ways she had let her own limited perspective blind her to her students' realities. She started really listening, asking questions, believing in possibilities rather than limitations. She invited General Williams back to speak to her class about leadership. She had Marcus help design a project about unsung heroes in military history, people whose stories challenged common assumptions. She made her classroom a place where every student's truth was honored and respected. Years later, when Marcus Williams graduated from West Point, following in his father's footsteps, Ms. Reynolds sat in the audience. General Williams, now retired, spotted her and made his way over during the reception. "Thank you for coming," he said warmly. "I wouldn't have missed it," she replied. "Marcus is an exceptional young man." "He is," the general agreed. "And you know what he told me? He said that incident in 7th grade, as painful as it was, taught him something important. It taught him that people can change. That mistakes don't have to define us. That there's power in forgiveness. Ms. Reynolds felt tears well up again, but this time they were different. He's wiser than I was at his age. Wiser than I was even a few years ago. General Williams smiled. We all grow, Ms. Reynolds. The key is being willing to learn. As she watched Marcus celebrate with his fellow graduates, their uniforms crisp and their futures bright, Ms. Reynolds thought about all the students she had taught over the years. How many had she misjudged? How many had she limited with her assumptions? And how many had she helped to flourish once she finally learned to listen? The lesson that day in the gymnasium had changed more than just one teacher's perspective. It had rippled outward, affecting every student who passed through room 304 afterward. Because sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we need most. And sometimes, the greatest gift is being given the chance to do better. Marcus Williams would go on to serve with distinction, leading with the same grace and wisdom his father had shown. And somewhere in his memory, carried alongside the pride of his achievements, was the moment when truth walked through that gymnasium door, when 4 stars gleamed in the light, and when one teacher learned that believing in young people means believing in all possibilities, not just the ones that fit our expectations. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of believing in others, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate dignity, redemption, and the strength of the human spirit. Leave a comment below telling us about a time when someone believed in you when others didn't, or when you learned to see beyond your own assumptions. Your story might inspire someone else on their journey. Thank you for listening, and remember, always choose to build up, never to tear down.